The morning mist hung heavy over the ancient castle, as Queen Isabella stood at her chamber window, watching the first rays of sunlight pierce through the gray clouds. At 35, she had ruled the kingdom of Valdoria for only 3 years, but today would test every lesson her father had taught her about leadership and sacrifice. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Your Majesty," came the soft voice of her lady-in-waiting, "the council awaits your presence." Isabella turned from the window, her long auburn hair catching the morning light. She had barely slept, knowing what news the council would bring. The reports had been trickling in all week. The neighboring kingdom of Moravia had fallen to a mysterious plague that seemed to spread faster than wildfire. Already, 3 border towns in Valdoria had reported the first cases. "Tell me, Sarah," Isabella said to her trusted companion, "do you think the people will understand what we must ask of them?" Sarah, who had served the royal family for 20 years, chose her words carefully. "The people love you, Your Majesty. They trust your judgment, but fear makes even the wisest souls question everything." As Isabella made her way through the stone corridors toward the council chamber, servants bowed deeply, but she noticed the worry etched on their faces. News traveled fast within the castle walls, and everyone knew that today's meeting would determine the fate of their kingdom. The heavy oak doors opened to reveal 12 men and women seated around a circular table, the kingdom's most trusted advisors, military leaders, and scholars. At the head sat Lord Chancellor Marcus, a man whose silver beard and deep-set eyes spoke of decades spent navigating political storms. "Your Majesty," Marcus began, rising with the others as she entered, "the situation has worsened overnight. The plague has reached the market town of Riverbrook, just 50 miles from our capital. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the kingdom's chief physician, spread several parchments across the table. The symptoms are unlike anything we've seen before. High fever, difficulty breathing, and most concerning, it spreads through the air itself. Those who contract it rarely survive beyond a week." General Rodriguez, a battle-hardened man who had never retreated from any fight, spoke with unusual gravity. "Your Majesty, our scouts report that Moravia's army has completely disbanded. Their king fled to the eastern mountains, leaving his people to fend for themselves." Isabella absorbed each word, feeling the weight of 6 million lives pressing down on her shoulders. She had studied history, knew of plagues that had destroyed entire civilizations. But reading about such things in dusty books was nothing compared to facing the reality of it threatening her own people. "What options do we have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "We could close all borders immediately," suggested Minister of Trade Helena. "Seal ourselves off completely until this passes." "And starve our people in the process?" countered Agriculture Minister James. "We depend on trade with 5 neighboring kingdoms for essential supplies." The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling as different strategies were proposed and discarded. Some suggested fleeing to the summer palace in the mountains. Others proposed drafting every able-bodied person into service to maintain order. As the sun reached its peak, Isabella finally stood, commanding silence. "Enough," she said quietly, but her voice carried to every corner of the room. "I've heard all your counsel, and I value each perspective, but this decision cannot be made by committee." She moved to the large map mounted on the chamber wall, tracing the borders of her kingdom with her finger. "My father once told me that a true ruler's greatest moment comes not in celebration, but in crisis. Not when choosing between good and better, but when choosing between terrible and catastrophic." Turning back to face her advisors, Isabella's green eyes held a resolve that surprised even herself. "We will not abandon our people, nor will we hide in the mountains like cowards. If this plague is to test our kingdom, then we shall meet it with everything we have." "But Your Majesty," Dr. Vasquez interjected, "the risk to your own life is no more important than the life of any farmer, baker, or child in this kingdom," Isabella finished firmly. "We are all Valdorians, and we will face this together." The Mie? Silence that followed was heavy with implication. Everyone in the room understood that their young queen had just chosen the most dangerous path possible. to stay and fight an enemy that couldn't be defeated with swords or strategy. As the meeting adjourned, Isabella remained behind, alone with her thoughts and the massive responsibility that now rested squarely on her shoulders. Through the tall windows, she could see people in the courtyard going about their daily tasks, unaware that their world was about to change forever. She whispered a prayer her mother had taught her years ago, asking for strength not for herself, but for her people. Tomorrow she would address the nation. Tonight she would prepare words that might either unite them in hope or crush their spirits entirely. The fate of Valdoria hung in the balance, and Queen Isabella knew there would be no turning back from the choice she had made. The cathedral bells chimed midnight as Isabella sat in her private study, surrounded by towers of books and scrolls. Her hands moved across parchment after parchment, drafting and redrafting the speech that would either inspire her people or send them into panic. Prince Alexander, her younger brother and closest confidant, entered quietly carrying 2 cups of steaming tea. At 28, he possessed their father's diplomatic wisdom and their mother's compassionate heart. "Still working?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "You've been at this for 8 hours straight." Isabella looked up, her eyes red from strain. How do you tell 6 million people that their world is about to change forever? How do you ask them to make sacrifices that might mean the difference between life and death? Alexander studied his sister's face, seeing the same determination that had driven her to personally visit every province during her first year as queen, sleeping in peasant homes and eating simple meals to understand her people's struggles. "Remember what Father used to say about honesty?" he offered gently. "That people can handle any truth if it comes from genuine care? But this isn't just truth, Alex. This is asking them to potentially sacrifice everything, their livelihoods, their freedom of movement, maybe even their lives." Isabella set down her quill and rubbed her temples. "The physicians estimate we have perhaps 2 weeks before the plague reaches the capital." Through the study windows, they could see torches, flickering throughout the city below. Even at this late hour, people were awake, sensing that something momentous was approaching. Rumors had begun spreading through the markets and taverns, growing more dramatic with each telling. "The council meeting this afternoon was intense," Isabella continued. "Lord Marcus believes we should implement martial law immediately, General. Rodriguez wants to evacuate the entire royal family to the mountain fortress. Dr. Vasquez insists we need to establish quarantine zones around every affected area." Alexander leaned forward. "And what does Queen Isabella believe?" The question hung in the air like incense in the cathedral. Isabella stood and walked to the portrait of their parents that hung above the fireplace. King Edmund and Queen Sophia had ruled during 30 years of peace and prosperity, never facing a crisis of this magnitude. "I believe," she said slowly, "that we cannot ask our people to do anything we wouldn't do ourselves. If we're asking families to separate, then we must be willing to make the same sacrifice. If we're asking citizens to risk their health serving others, then we must lead by example." "That sounds dangerously close to martyrdom," Alexander observed, though his tone held admiration rather than criticism. Isabella turned back to him, and for a moment, he saw not the queen, but the little girl who used to sneak into the kitchen to steal honey cakes with him. "Maybe it is. But what's the alternative? Rule from a distance while our people suffer? Send orders from a safe mountain castle while families are torn apart by disease and fear?" A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Sarah entered with a message bearing the royal seal of King Ferdinand from the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. Isabella broke the wax seal and read quickly, her expression growing more troubled with each line. "Ferdinand is sealing his borders," she told Alexander. "Complete isolation. No trade, no travel, no communication until this plague passes. He's asking if we want to coordinate a joint response. Which means abandoning the border territories to create a buffer zone. Let the plague burn itself out in the outer regions while we protect the major population centers." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, understanding the impossible choice his sister faced. Save some by sacrificing others, or risk everyone by trying to save all. The crown jewels, Isabella said suddenly. What about them? We'll sell them. All of them. Use the gold to buy medical supplies, food for quarantine centers, compensation for families who lose their livelihoods. She began pacing, her mind racing with possibilities. If we're asking people to sacrifice, we should sacrifice first. Isabella, those jewels have been in our family for 4 centuries. They're not just valuable, they're symbols of the monarchy itself. And what good are symbols if there's no kingdom left to symbolize? As dawn approached, Isabella finally completed her speech. The words were simple, direct, and asked more of her people than any monarch had ever requested. She would announce it tomorrow from the great balcony overlooking the Capitol Square, where thousands would gather to hear their queen's words. But first, there was one more decision to make, one that would define not just her reign, but her character as both a ruler and a human being. Alex, she said, folding the speech carefully, I want you to take command of the evacuation efforts in the eastern provinces. You'll be safer there, and the people need someone they trust to organize the response. And where will you be? Isabella met his eyes steadily. Here, in the capital. If the plague reaches us, I'll be with the physicians and nurses in the hospital wards. If there are food shortages, I'll help distribute supplies in the markets. If families need comfort, I'll visit their homes. Alexander started to protest, but Isabella held up her hand. This isn't about being heroic or dramatic. It's about being the kind of leader our people need right now. They need to know that their queen won't abandon them no matter how dark things become. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, both siblings understood that everything would change after today. The comfortable routines of royal life, the predictable ceremonies and state dinners, the illusion that their medieval kingdom existed in a bubble protected from the harsh realities of the world, all of that was about to end. In a few hours, Queen Isabella would step onto that balcony and deliver words that would either unite her kingdom in common purpose or divide it in panic and fear. Either way, there would be no turning back from the path she had chosen. The crown had never felt heavier on her head, but Isabella had never been more certain that she was wearing it for the right reasons. The great square below the castle had never seen such a crowd. From her chamber window, Isabella could see thousands of people packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces turned upward toward the royal balcony. Farmers had abandoned their fields. Merchants had closed their shops, and families had traveled for days from distant villages to hear their queen's words. Your Majesty, General Rodriguez appeared at her door, his usually stern face showing unusual concern. The crowd is larger than we anticipated. There are reports of people fainting from the heat and press of bodies. Perhaps we should consider addressing them in smaller groups? Isabella adjusted the simple blue dress she had chosen instead of her formal royal robes. No, General, they came here together. They deserve to hear this together. At precisely noon, Isabella stepped onto the balcony with Prince Alexander at her side. The roar that went up from the crowd was deafening, a mixture of loyalty, fear, and desperate hope. She raised her hand, and slowly, the thousands of voices quieted until the only sound was the whisper of wind through the castle flags. My beloved people of Valdoria, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the square thanks to the stone acoustics of the ancient courtyard. I stand before you today not just as your queen, but as someone who shares your fears, your hopes, and your determination to protect everything we hold dear. In the crowd below, she could see faces of all ages, weathered farmers, young mothers holding children, elderly craftsmen who had served the kingdom their entire lives. Each face told a story of hard work, simple dreams, and trust in their monarch. You have heard rumors about the plague that has devastated our neighbor Moravia. Today I must tell you that those rumors are true, and that this disease has crossed our borders. 3 towns in our eastern provinces have reported cases, and our physicians believe it will spread further. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Isabella paused, allowing them to absorb this confirmation of their worst fears. Other kingdoms are sealing their borders, abandoning their outer territories, hiding behind walls of stone and fear. I will not ask you to cower, In the shadows, while our fellow Valdorians faced this crisis alone, her voice grew stronger, more resolute. Instead, I ask something far more difficult. I ask for your courage. I ask for your sacrifice. I ask you to join me in fighting this plague not with swords or arrows, but with unity, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to protecting every single life in our kingdom. An old man near the front of the crowd called out, "What do you need from us, Your Majesty?" Isabella smiled, recognizing Thomas the blacksmith who had forged her first sword. When she was 12 years old, "Thomas, I need you to help convert your forge into a station for boiling water and sterilizing medical instruments. I need the seamstresses to make masks and protective clothing for our physicians. I need the farmers to organize food distribution. To families who cannot leave their homes," she continued, addressing the crowd as individuals rather than a faceless mass. "I need the teachers to help maintain order in the quarantine centers. I need the musicians to lift spirits in the hospitals. I need the priests to provide comfort to the frightened and hope to the despairing." "What about the cost?" shouted a woman from the middle of the crowd. "How will we feed our families if we cannot work?" Isabella had been waiting for this question. She lifted a small wooden box that had been sitting on the balcony ledge, a box that contained the royal crown, passed down through 15 generations of monarchs. "This crown has been in my family for 400 years, she announced, removing the circlet of gold and precious gems. "Today I am selling it, along with every other piece of royal jewelry, every golden plate, every valuable artifact in the royal treasury." Gasps echoed across the square as people realized what they were witnessing. "This gold will establish a fund to support every family affected by the plague. If you cannot work because you are caring for the sick, you will receive compensation. If your business fails because of quarantine measures, we will help you rebuild. If you lose your home, we will provide shelter." She placed the crown back in its box, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she had just announced. "These are just objects. Pretty, valuable objects, but objects nonetheless. You, each of you, are worth more than all the treasure in this castle." Prince Alexander stepped forward. "And I will be traveling to the eastern provinces tomorrow to coordinate relief efforts there. Every member of the royal family will be involved in this fight, from the highest noble to the newest page in the castle." The crowd was completely silent now, absorbing the reality that their queen was asking them to sacrifice while sacrificing everything herself. Isabella continued, "I will not lie to you about what lies ahead. Some of us may fall sick. Some of us may die. The road ahead is dark and uncertain. But I would rather face that darkness standing beside you than hide in safety while my people suffer. We will establish medical centers in every town. We will ensure that no family goes hungry. We will maintain communication between all provinces so that no community faces this crisis alone. And we will do all of this together as one people, united by something stronger than fear." A young voice called out from the crowd, "Your Majesty, what if the plague cannot be stopped? What if our efforts fail?" Isabella looked down at the child, who had spoken, a girl of perhaps 10 years old, held in her father's arms to see over the crowd. "Then we will fail together, having given everything we had to protect each other, and that failure will be more honorable than any victory won, through cowardice or abandonment." The silence stretched for a long moment. Then, slowly, a single person began clapping. Another joined, then another, until the applause rolled through the square like thunder. People were crying, some from fear, some from relief, some from pride in their queen's words. But Isabella noticed something else in their faces now. Where there had been uncertainty and panic before her speech, she now saw something different. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of purpose, not false confidence, but genuine determination. As the crowd began to disperse, many people lingered, forming small groups to discuss what they had heard and what they could do to help. Isabella remained on the balcony, watching her people transform, from frightened individuals into a united community. "That was either the bravest or most foolish speech in royal history," Alexander murmured beside her. "Probably both," Isabella replied, but her eyes were bright with something that hadn't been there that morning: hope. But look at them, Alex. Really look at them. Below in the square, the blacksmith Thomas was already talking animatedly with Dr. Vasquez about converting his forge. A group of seamstresses had surrounded the head nurse, taking notes about what kind of protective gear would be needed. Farmers were organizing committees to ensure steady food supplies to affected areas. They're not just going home to wait for disaster, Isabella observed. They're going home to prepare for battle. As the sun set over the kingdom of Valdoria that evening, Queen Isabella had no way of knowing whether her decision would save her, people, or doom them. But she knew with absolute certainty that she had chosen the only path her conscience would allow. The real test was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since Isabella's speech in the Great Square, and the kingdom she ruled had transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a peaceful realm of farming villages and market towns now resembled a military operation dedicated to saving lives instead of taking them. Isabella stood in the main hospital ward that had been hastily constructed in the castle's great hall, watching Dr. Vasquez examine a young farmer who had arrived that morning with the telltale fever and breathing difficulties. The ornate tapestries and golden chandeliers had been replaced with simple cots, medical supplies, and the constant bustle of nurses, volunteers, and family members caring for the sick. His fever has broken, Dr. Vasquez announced quietly to Isabella. That makes him the 15th patient to recover this week. Isabella felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by the knowledge that they had also lost 12 patients in the same period. Each death had felt personal, each recovery a small miracle. She had learned the names of every person who passed through the hospital, their families, their stories. Your Majesty, called Maria, a seamstress who had become one of the most dedicated volunteers. The evening supply report is ready. Isabella accepted the parchment, scanning the carefully recorded numbers. Food distribution, adequate in most regions, concerning in the eastern provinces. Medical supplies, running low on certain herbs but adequate overall. Morale, surprisingly high throughout most of the kingdom. The mask production is exceeding our projections, Maria continued with obvious pride. The Seamstresses Guild has organized shifts so that work continues around the clock. Even the children are helping by sorting fabric scraps. Through the tall windows, Isabella could see the courtyard where volunteers worked by torchlight, preparing supplies to be sent to affected areas. What struck her most was not just their industriousness, but their spirit. People sang while they worked, shared meals together, told stories to keep each other's energy up during long shifts. Prince Alexander appeared at her elbow, looking tired but determined. He had just returned from a 2-week tour of the eastern provinces, organizing relief efforts in the areas closest to the Moravian border. The situation in Riverbrook has stabilized, he reported, accepting a cup of herb tea from one of the volunteers. We've established 3 recovery centers and managed to slow the spread significantly. The quarantine protocols are working, but the emotional toll on families is substantial. Isabella nodded, having seen firsthand how the necessary separation of sick family members affected entire communities. And the supply lines? Holding steady, thanks to the collaboration between the Merchants Guild and the Farmers Cooperative. Though I must say the innovation has been remarkable. Master Carpenter Henrik has designed portable beds that can be assembled quickly in any building. The bakers have developed a high-nutrition bread that stores well and provides maximum energy for volunteers. These small victories mattered enormously. Each creative solution, each act of collaboration, each moment of selflessness represented the kingdom working as Isabella had hoped, not as subjects following orders, but as citizens, united in common cause. Your Majesty, Dr. Vasquez approached with a more serious expression. I need to discuss the situation in the capital with you privately. They moved to a quieter corner of the makeshift hospital, where the doctor's words confirmed Isabella's growing concern. We've identified 7 cases within the city walls, she said quietly. All are isolated and receiving care, but the implications, the plague has reached the heart of the kingdom, Isabella finished. How long do we have before it spreads more widely? Days, perhaps a week at most. The protocols we've established will help. But in a city this size with this population density, Dr. Vasquez didn't need to complete the thought. Isabella felt the familiar weight of leadership settling on her shoulders. But it felt different now than it had a month ago. Then, it had been the burden of making impossible decisions alone. Now, it was the responsibility of leading people who had already proven their courage and commitment. We need to prepare the citizens without causing panic, she decided. Double the medical facilities in the city, increase the volunteer training programs, and begin the household isolation protocols we developed for the eastern provinces. And Your Majesty's own safety? Dr. Vasquez asked pointedly. Isabella looked around the great hall, now filled with sick patients, exhausted volunteers, and the quiet activity of people fighting for each other's lives. My safety is inseparable from theirs. I made that choice 3 weeks ago and I don't regret it. That evening, as Isabella made her nightly rounds through the hospital wards, she stopped at the bedside of Elena, a young mother from one of the border towns. Elena's 2 children had been staying in the castle's converted nursery while their mother recovered, and Isabella had been reading them stories each night. Your Majesty, Elena whispered, her voice still weak but her eyes alert. My children, are they healthy and happy? Isabella assured her, adjusting the woman's pillows. Little Marcus asked me to tell you that he's learned to write his name, and Sophia has been helping in the kitchen gardens. They ask about you constantly. Tears rolled down Elena's cheeks, but she smiled. I never expected. When I was brought here, I thought I would die alone, far from home. But this place, these people, you've made us all family. This was the transformation Isabella had hoped for, but never dared expect. The crisis that could have torn the kingdom apart had instead woven it together more tightly than ever before. Noble families worked alongside peasants, merchants shared resources freely with competitors, and strangers cared for each other's children as if they were their own. But Isabella also knew that the hardest test was yet to come. When the plague spread through the capital, when resources became truly scarce, when fear began to override hope, that would be when their unity faced its greatest challenge. Later that night, she stood again at her chamber window, looking out over her kingdom. But instead of the peaceful village lights she had once seen, now she observed something far more complex and moving. The lights of a society that had transformed itself to meet an unprecedented challenge. In the hospital wards, medical staff worked through the night. In workshops throughout the city, craftsmen produced supplies for the relief effort. In homes across the kingdom, families followed protocols designed to protect not just themselves, but their entire community. We're not the same people we were a month ago, she said aloud to the empty room. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who had aged years and weeks, whose face carried lines of worry and exhaustion, but her eyes held something that hadn't been there before. The quiet confidence of someone who had asked everything of her people and seen them respond with more courage and compassion than she had ever imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more difficult decisions, possibly more losses. But tonight, Queen Isabella of Valdoria knew that whatever came next, her people would face it together. The crown might be gone, sold for gold to support the relief efforts, but the kingdom had never been stronger. The morning that would later be remembered as the kingdom's darkest hour began like any other. Isabella woke before dawn, reviewed the night reports from all provinces, and made her way to the hospital ward to check on patients who had been critical the evening before. But something was different. Dr. Vasquez met her at the entrance with an expression Isabella had never seen before, not just concern, but something approaching despair. Your Majesty, we need to speak immediately, the doctor said, guiding Isabella to the small office they had set up in what was once the castle's music room. 17 new cases overnight, Dr. Vasquez began without preamble. All within the capital city. The spread is accelerating faster than our most pessimistic projections. Isabella felt her stomach tighten but kept her voice steady. Hospital capacity? We'll exceed it by tomorrow evening, even with the additional wards we've prepared. But that's not the worst news. Dr. Vasquez hesitated, then continued. 3 of our most experienced nurses have fallen ill and, Your Majesty, one of the new patients is Prince Alexander. The world seemed to stop. Isabella gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. When? How? He returned from the eastern provinces with symptoms yesterday evening, but insisted. It was merely exhaustion. This morning, there's no question. He has the plague. Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the crushing weight of personal fear combining with royal responsibility. Alexander wasn't just her brother. He was her closest advisor, her emotional anchor, and the person she had planned to rely on to maintain the kingdom if she herself fell ill. I want to see him, she said quietly. Your Majesty, the risk of transmission? I want to see him, Isabella repeated, this time with the unmistakable tone of royal command. Prince Alexander lay in one of the isolation chambers, his face flushed with fever, but his eyes alert when Isabella entered wearing the protective mask and robes Dr. Vasquez had insisted upon. You shouldn't be here, Alexander said, his voice hoarse but still carrying his familiar warmth. A kingdom can't afford to lose its queen to sentiment. A queen can't afford to lose her conscience to duty, Isabella replied, sitting in the chair beside his bed. How do you feel? Like I've been trampled by cavalry horses, but my spirits are surprisingly good. Alexander managed a weak smile. Do you know what I keep thinking about? That little girl in the square who asked what would happen if we failed? What about her? I think we already succeeded, Isabella. Not in preventing the plague. That was never entirely within our power. But in proving that people can be better than their fears, stronger than their individual limitations. Isabella felt tears stinging her eyes behind the protective eyewear. Alex, you're going to recover. Dr. Vasquez says the treatments are becoming more effective. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. But either way, look what we've accomplished together. Alexander's voice grew stronger, more passionate despite his physical weakness. A month ago, our people were strangers to each other, connected only by geography and shared rulers. Now they're a true community united by shared purpose and mutual care. Before Isabella could respond, urgent voices erupted from the corridor outside. Through the chamber door, she could hear Dr. Vasquez calling for additional medical staff and someone shouting about supply shortages. Isabella squeezed Alexander's hand briefly, then hurried back to the main hospital area to find controlled chaos. 5 more patients had arrived in the past hour, all in critical condition, and the medical staff was struggling to provide adequate care with their stretched resources. Your Majesty, called Thomas the blacksmith, who had become an unofficial coordinator for the volunteer efforts. We've got a problem with the eastern supply route. 3 of our transport wagons haven't returned from their scheduled deliveries. Bandits? Isabella asked, though she feared the answer was something worse. Plague? Most likely. The drivers may have fallen ill, or the villages they were serving may no longer be able to provide the usual support. The magnitude of the crisis was expanding beyond even Isabella's prepared contingencies. They were losing medical staff to illness, losing supply lines to the plague's spread, and facing the real possibility that their carefully organized relief efforts might collapse entirely. Your Majesty, Dr. Vasquez approached with another urgent report. The quarantine protocols in the merchant district have broken down. Families are ignoring isolation orders to care for each other, and while I understand the emotional reasons, it's accelerating transmission. Isabella looked around the great hall, seeing exhaustion in every face, fear beginning to creep back into eyes that had shown only determination for weeks. The volunteers were still working, still caring for patients, still following protocols, but she could sense that they were reaching the limits of human endurance. For the first time since the crisis began, Isabella felt the cold touch of genuine doubt. Had she asked too much? Had her refusal to abandon the outer provinces and evacuate to safety doomed not just herself but everyone who had trusted her leadership? Your Majesty, came a small voice from behind her. Isabella turned to see Sophia, the 6-year-old daughter of Elena, the mother who was slowly recovering in the hospital ward. The child had been staying in the castle's makeshift nursery with other children whose parents were ill. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Some of the grown-ups are scared," Sophia said with the directness of childhood. "They think maybe we can't help everyone get better." Isabella knelt down to Sophia's eye level, seeing in the child's face an innocence that hadn't been touched by the fear spreading among the adults. "What do you think, Sophia?" The little girl considered this seriously. "I think maybe we can't make everyone all better, but we can still take care of each other. That's what you taught us, right? That taking care of each other is what makes us a family?" In that moment, Isabella realized that a 6-year-old had grasped something that she, in her exhaustion and growing panic, had lost sight of. Success didn't require saving every life, preventing every tragedy, or solving every problem perfectly. Success required maintaining their commitment to each other regardless of the outcome. "You're absolutely right, Sophia," Isabella said, feeling some of her strength returning. "We are a family, and families don't give up on each other." Standing up, Isabella looked around the great hall with new eyes. Yes, people were exhausted and frightened. Yes, the crisis was overwhelming their resources, but they were still here, still working, still caring for each other with a dedication that would have been unimaginable 2 months ago. The worst day was far from over, but Isabella now understood that even in failure, they had achieved something profound. They had discovered who they really were as a people, and that discovery was worth whatever price they might yet have to pay. The kingdom's greatest test was still ahead, but they would face it as they had everything else, together. 6 months later, Isabella stood once again at her chamber window. But the kingdom spread below her had changed in ways that went far beyond the physical rebuilding that was still ongoing. The morning mist was lifting to reveal a landscape dotted with new structures. Medical centers, community workshops, and small monuments marking places where significant acts of courage and sacrifice had occurred during the plague months. The plague itself had finally run its course 3 weeks ago, leaving behind a kingdom forever altered but unmistakably stronger. The final count showed they had lost nearly 800 souls, a devastating number, yet far fewer than the worst projections had predicted. More importantly, they had saved thousands who might have been lost if the kingdom had followed the path of isolation and abandonment. Prince Alexander emerged from his chambers, moving slowly but steadily as he continued his recovery. He had been among the fortunate ones. His fever had broken after 2 agonizing weeks, and though he remained weak, Dr. Vasquez assured everyone that he would make a full recovery. "The council is assembled," he told Isabella, though his voice still carried the rasp that many plague survivors retained. "They're eager to hear your decision about the reconstruction proposals." Isabella nodded, but didn't immediately move from the window. Below in the courtyard she could see children playing, including little Sophia, whose mother Elena had not only recovered, but had become one of the kingdom's most effective community organizers. The children's laughter echoed off the castle walls, a sound that had been absent for months during the darkest period of the crisis. "Alex," she said quietly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had made different choices? If we had sealed the borders, evacuated to the mountains, followed the path that every other kingdom chose?" Alexander joined her at the window, following her gaze to the bustling activity below. "Every day," he admitted, "and every day I become more certain we chose correctly. Even knowing what it cost us. Especially knowing what it cost us." Alexander's voice carried a conviction that had only grown stronger since his recovery. "Look at them, Isabella. Really look." In the courtyard, former peasants worked alongside former nobles, their previous social distinctions having dissolved during the months when survival depended entirely on cooperation rather than hierarchy. The seamstresses who had worked around the clock producing protective gear were now teaching their skills to anyone interested in learning. The farmers who had reorganized food distribution had formed permanent cooperatives that were proving more efficient than the old individual systems. "We didn't just save lives," Alexander continued. "We discovered something about ourselves that we never would have known otherwise. We learned that when everything artificial is stripped away, titles, wealth, social position. What remains is simply people caring for people. Isabella finally turned from the window and made her way toward the council chamber. But her path took her through the great hall that had served as a hospital during the crisis. The medical equipment was gone now, the ornate tapestries and chandeliers restored, but the room felt different, sacred somehow in the way that places do when they have witnessed profound human suffering and equally profound human compassion. The council chamber held the same 12 advisors as before, but their faces told the story of a shared ordeal that had changed them all. Lord Chancellor Marcus had lost his eldest son to the plague but had continued working throughout his grief. Dr. Vasquez bore the permanent exhaustion of someone who had pushed human endurance beyond its limits. General Rodriguez, who had never lost a battle in 30 years of military service, had discovered that the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies but from serving others. Your Majesty, Marcus began as Isabella took her seat. We've received formal proposals from the guild councils, the farmers' cooperatives, and the Merchants' Association regarding the permanent reorganization of the kingdom's governance structure. Isabella had been expecting this. The crisis had created new forms of organization, new networks of cooperation, new ways of making decisions that involved far more people than the traditional royal hierarchy. The question now was whether to formalize these changes or attempt to return to the old systems. They're proposing a confederation model, Dr. Vasquez explained, spreading several documents across the table. Local communities would maintain significant autonomy in managing their affairs, while the Crown would coordinate between regions and handle external relations. Essentially, added Minister Helena, they want to make permanent the collaborative structures that emerged during the plague response. Isabella studied the proposals carefully. What the people were requesting was nothing short of a fundamental transformation of how the kingdom operated, from a top-down monarchy to something closer to a cooperative federation with the crown, serving as a unifying symbol and coordinating authority rather than an absolute ruler. And if I refuse these changes? Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. They'll implement them anyway, General Rodriguez said bluntly. Your Majesty, with respect, the people have discovered they can govern themselves effectively. They've seen proof that their voices matter, that their contributions are essential. They won't willingly return to being passive subjects. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications. She could try to reassert traditional, royal authority, but doing so would betray everything they had accomplished together during the crisis. Alternatively, she could embrace this transformation and help guide the kingdom toward a new form of governance that honored both tradition and the lessons they had learned. There's something else, Alexander interjected. The neighboring kingdoms are watching our recovery with great interest. King Ferdinand of Astoria has requested formal meetings to discuss our innovative approaches to crisis management. Queen Catherine of Westmarch wants to send observers to study our community health systems. They want to learn from us, Isabella realized. Other kingdoms are recognizing that our response was more effective than their isolation strategies. More than that, Marcus added with obvious pride. They're recognizing that we've created something entirely new, a form of governance that combines royal leadership with genuine community participation. Isabella stood and walked to the large map of Valdoria mounted on the chamber wall. The borders looked the same as they always had, but she knew that everything within those borders had been fundamentally transformed. Very well, she said finally. We'll formalize the confederation structure, with one modification. She turned back to face her advisors. Every major decision affecting the kingdom will be made through consultation with community representatives. But in times of crisis, when immediate action is required, the Crown retains the authority to act quickly and decisively. A crisis monarchy within a peacetime confederation, Alexander mused. It could work. It will work, Isabella corrected, because it's based on relationships of trust and mutual respect that we've already proven during the hardest test any of us could imagine. As the meeting concluded and the advisors dispersed to begin implementing the new governmental structure, Isabella remained behind with Alexander. Through the chamber windows, they could see the sun setting over their transformed kingdom, casting golden light over communities that were busily rebuilding not just their physical structures, but their entire way of life. "Do you think we'll be remembered as the monarchs who gave up their power?" Alexander asked. Isabella smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I hope we'll be remembered as the monarchs who discovered that true power comes from serving something greater than yourself." That evening, for the first time since the crisis began, Isabella wore a crown. Not the ancient golden circlet that had been sold to fund the relief efforts, but a simple silver band that the Metalworkers Guild had crafted as a gift. It was engraved with words suggested by the children in the castle nursery, "For caring for each other." As she prepared for bed, Isabella reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. 6 months ago, she had been a traditional monarch facing an impossible choice. Tonight, she was the coordinator of a thriving federation, trusted not because of her bloodline or her titles, but because she had proven willing to sacrifice everything for her people's welfare. The plague had taken much from them, but it had also given them something invaluable: the knowledge that ordinary people working together with courage and compassion could overcome challenges that seemed insurmountable. Queen Isabella of Valdoria fell asleep that night knowing that her kingdom had not just survived its greatest test, but had emerged from it as something entirely new and infinitely stronger. They had learned that true leadership meant not ruling over people, but standing with them, and that discovery would shape their future for generations to come. The crown she wore now might be simpler than the one her ancestors had passed down, but it represented something far more precious: the trust of a people who had chosen to follow her not because they had to, but because they wanted to, and that, Isabella knew, was worth more than all the gold and jewels in all the kingdoms of the world.